Welcome to this first conversation in a series of conversations with people from the API-verse. Zuplo is an API gateway that has just launched OpenAPI support as a native feature. That's how you configure the gateway and the routes. And so we're doing a special week of conversations with influential luminaries from the OpenAPI and API specification world. And today, in our first session, we're very lucky to be joined by Darrel Miller, who will introduce himself in just a second. Hi, Darrel.
Hey, Josh. Thanks for having me. Awesome
Thanks for joining. Yeah, no, great. And I think you're the perfect person to start this session. And just to let people know what we're going to talk about, we're going to go over what is OpenAPI, all of the basics in this first session. I think you're the perfect person for that, and some of the advanced stuff too, obviously. But a great place to start. So tell us a little bit. Who are you? What do you do? What's your day job?
I work at Microsoft. I work on a rather large API called Microsoft Graph.
Huge.
And so I'm an architect on that team. I help teams do the designs to bring the APIs to Microsoft Graph. And I also help on a lot of the client-side tooling and the developer experience type stuff. And so that's what I do most of the time there. And then I also I have been working in the OpenAPI initiative since 2016, working on the OpenAPI specification, and I also dabble in one of the IETF working groups working on HTTP API specifications over there. So it keeps me out of trouble.
Awesome. So you've already given me some questions to ask, like what is the OpenAPI initiative and what is the OpenAPI specification? Like we will start there. What is your role? Well, before we get into those details, what is your role with OpenAPI? What are you doing with it? Are you just a user? What are you doing?
I'm technically one of what we refer to as the technical steering committee, which really officially comes down to I'm one of the people who can actually click the merge button on GitHub. But it's a very much a community-driven effort. We have we run on GitHub, we run on Slack, we run on a meeting that we have every Thursday that's open to anybody. We have a GitHub issue that you can come and join and you can contribute, and anybody who wants to get involved can get involved. And I kind of help shepherd those meetings and make sure that we're talking about topics that are moving us forward, hopefully. And over the years, I've contributed some of the words into the specification and certainly been a big participant in a lot of the conversation discussions, deciding what should go into the next version spec, what shouldn't. And so it is, as I say, very much a community effort.
Awesome. Okay, that makes sense. So you're the merge maestro or something is the informal job title I'm going to give you.
There's six of us. The six of us have the power to press the button.
Awesome. Okay. So that's great. And so obviously a great person to talk to about OpenAPI. And we'll include for folks some links in the comments of this video that show how people can get involved, where your Slack group is, and some details about those Thursday meetings, and of course links to the specification itself. But let's get into it then. Let's imagine I have landed on planet Earth and I know what a HTTP API is. I think we can start there. We don't need to start any higher than that. I've heard of REST. I probably make REST-ish APIs. I've probably heard of some other things like GraphQL and SOAP, maybe if I've been around long enough. What is OpenAPI? Let's imagine I haven't seen this term before. How would you explain that to this alien?
Yeah, so OpenAPI it's a chunk of metadata. It's a metadata document that tells me about the API that I've built. And it describes all of the resources that are in that API. It describes the HTTP methods that can be used to interact with those resources. It describes the shape of the representations that I need to send and come back. It tells me the shape of the URLs and what parameters could go in there. It's like everything that you would find in API documentation. OpenAPI descriptions are a machine-readable version of that. And there's just a wide range of scenarios that you can use an OpenAPI description. So kind of starting from the beginning, you could start with, like, a lot of people will actually use it as a document to start designing their API. Start with a blank text document. Start, if you like JSON, you can write in JSON. If you prefer YAML, you can write in YAML. And there's a syntax and structure, and you can just start kind of roughing out your API. Here are the resources that I need, but not actually go into the details initially, and you can get a feel for the API. And then slowly you can start to flesh out the details. And then there's a set of tools around the OpenAPI document. You can use tools like Swagger UI in order to create a visual representation in the web page of that API. You can use tools like Redoctly for generating documentation of the API. There's editor tools. There's a variety. A Stoplighter, an editor tool. Tools like Postman can consume OpenAPI descriptions. API management products can import those APIs in order to help you doing the setup to describe the set of APIs. There's mocking tools, there's client generation tools. There's just a really rich ecosystem around those API descriptions. And as I said, some people will start from they're designing the API based on it. Other people will come the other way around. They'll go and they'll build an API in their favorite framework, and then they'll say, okay, well, I would also like docs related to this, or I would like an experience where somebody can play around and try with the API. And there are libraries that will introspect into an API framework and generate an open API description based on the API that you've built, which will then allow you to participate in that ecosystem of tooling.
Awesome. Okay, so there's some things to unpack there. So you started out, you mentioned it's like a machine readable API documentation. So just to be clear, what I think you mean there is, like, if I looked at Stripe's API reference or the website for Microsoft Graph, and I see all this, this HTML that tells me how to use the API, you're saying OpenAPI is like a JSON or YAML formatted version of that another machine can read.
Yes. Yes.
And as a person who's been doing this too long, it reminds me of things like WSDL from the SOAP area, which was called Web Service Definition Language. But you've said something
Waddle.
Waddle. Yeah. I'm sure. Interesting. Is that where cattle came from? We pause that thought. We can talk about that later. We did wonder where cattle came from. One thing that's weird, though, is you mentioned people write this first sometimes. Like, that is not my experience with WSDL. I don't know any person who wrote WSDL first. I might be wrong. I'm sure they're out there. But they were usually generated from the code, right? Usually I'd write some .NET code or whatever it was, and I'd generate my web service definition language. Does that happen in OpenAPI as well? Do people write code and generate OpenAPI from code?
Yeah.
Or
absolutely. There's a wide range of tools that in different languages, different platforms that will emit an OpenAPI description from an API implementation. Yeah.
Got it. And then you mentioned, though, that in this case, people often will start with the OpenAPI document first. Does this approach have a name? Why are they doing that? Like, what's the benefit? Why not just they're going to write the code anyway. Why not just write the code and generate the OpenAPI doc that way?
We tend to use the phrase design first, code first.
Okay.
To indicate, so this is the design first, or some people will say API first, but then that kind of gets into the API as a product, so it's a bit of a more nebulous term. But yeah, so if somebody says design first APIs and they're talking about API descriptions, yeah, they're talking about, you start with a document and you design it via that artifact first. Now, one of the advantages of doing that, well, there's a few advantages of doing it that way. You can, if you're in a big org like we are, we have a set of API review bodies where you have to bring your API design to a review body, and people will review it and say, yes, you're meeting our API guidelines, or here we have some suggestions as how you can go and change it. And funnily enough, developers are a lot more accommodating with making changes to their API design before they've gone and written a bunch of code. If they go and write a bunch of code and then they come with their API design, when you say, yeah, we'd like you to change that, they tend to be less happy about it. So we, within Microsoft, we are fairly strict at telling developers, don't go write production code and then come to us for API review. Come to us with a design artifact and then go write it. There's Go ahead.
Oh yeah, no, this makes a ton of sense. Even we're an API company. We have a gateway, but we have APIs ourselves. And as a sort of early company, we just spat out some code, and it was only actually when some of us were using our own API, we're like, this isn't designed very nicely, is it? We didn't do a good job on this, and that's shipped. It's live. It's in production. People are using it. So yeah, I kind of can see that if we'd have had some way of modeling the API and seeing it, so we could sort of spot those ugly things we'd done, in an easier way than having to actually use the API, that would be valuable. So that's what people are doing with OpenAPI. What it sounds like you're saying.
There's another great scenario where somebody is building an API to drive their specific client app, and it allows the client and the server team to get together, define an API that allows them both to believe that they can meet the scenarios, the requirements for the app. They define the spec, and then they can use mocking tools. And so they go mock using the API description, mock an API up, and the client developer can go off and start building their client tooling around that mock API and start to get mock responses back, whilst the server developers are going off and actually building the implementation. And so you get this kind of parallel effort where you don't have to, one team doesn't have to wait for the other team to finish before that they can actually start doing things. And then you can more quickly surface issues like where the client team go, hey, we need these other features to be able to generate this kind of UX, or the server team go, yeah, that thing that we said we were going to be able to do, turns out we're not going to be able to do. Is there another way that we can do it via the API? So it's a great way of parallelizing effort when you are building a client for a particular API.
Oh, interesting. So I'm seeing, hearing lots of benefits of things you get out of this OpenAPI artifact when you get it. So you can do mocking, you can do documentation generation, so that Stripe API spec that we talked about, or the graph one, could be generated from OpenAPI. Is that what happens at Microsoft? Do you actually use OpenAPI to generate the documentation?
That depends which part of Microsoft you're talking about. Yes, there are lots of teams, especially internally, who use OpenAPI to generate documentation and generate kind of like the Swagger UI type of experience. There's also, I know our Azure team use OpenAPI descriptions to generate reference documentation using their DocFX tooling. We in Microsoft Graph, our API is actually natively not described in OpenAPI. Historically, a lot of the APIs in Microsoft Office were OData-based APIs, so we actually have a different API description language. However, we then take that API description language, CSDL as it's called, and convert it into OpenAPI to drive our client generator. And so we've built a client generator tool called Kyoto, that takes standard OpenAPI and it generates our client libraries for
Wait a minute,
Microsoft
so
Graph.
there's another use case then you're saying is that you can take this document and generate an SDK, is that right? Like, so, if I go to someone's website and they have an API, often like Stripe, they will have an SDK, and so that can be used with this Kyoto technology, which we'll include a link for as well, to generate APIs. I think lots of companies do this, in my understanding. Like, I think, all of AWS's SDKs are generated from some definition. I don't know if it's OpenAPI, but they're auto-generated, I think, to some degree.
Yeah, they have a language they call Smithy. And I
interesting.
believe they go from Smithy to OpenAPI and then generate from OpenAPI, although I'm not 100% sure of that. Yeah, there's still a fairly wide variety of different languages that people have built for designing APIs, and then they convert it for compatibility and interop reasons to take advantage of the OpenAPI ecosystem. RAML do that. MuleSoft's RAML, they have converters to convert it into OpenAPI.
Okay, so it sounds like actually there's like OpenAPI can kind of sit at the hub of a lot of benefits around APIs: mocking, client generation, documentation generation. Not sure if there's any other big ones you would add to that.
Testing.
So tell me about testing. What does testing look like with OpenAPI? How does that help?
Testing allows them a testing tool to go and introspect into the OpenAPI description and then actually call the API. There's futzing tools. There's
interesting.
all kinds of different testing. And then there's also linting tools insofar as we as an organization have said, okay, we have API guidelines. Like the nice thing about HTTP is very flexible. The downside of it, there's 5 ways of doing the same thing potentially. And within an organization, people will say, okay, these are our guidelines. This is how we design our HTTP APIs. And then the question is, well, how do we ensure that all of our teams are actually doing that? And so one way is to actually have automated tools that go and lint. And there's an open source tool called Spectral. That will go and analyze an OpenAPI description. You can run a whole bunch of rules against it to make sure that it is meeting your API guidelines.
So it sounds like you folks have like an architectural Jedi council at Microsoft who gets to review I feel like the Star
You make
Wars
it sound so much more sophisticated than it actually is, but yeah.
I know it's pretty sophisticated, really. But you know, so you have this, and the Spectral is kind of like you can automate some of that process. So, you know, the silly things like, is it kebab cased or whatever your policies are, you can catch that stuff before it even gets to the council, and sort of automate some of the governance with like a lowercase g, I think. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, there's if you can get a human out of the loop, and also it's better get it upstream, right? Where somebody's doing design work and let them know as soon as possible. So have stuff integrated into editors that can start doing that linting immediately for you, so that people can learn the style and the guidelines of your organization. You know, having those really fast inner dev loops is really great when it comes to do API design, and having the tooling that can just go and look and go, yeah, your API is not quite the way that we normally do it within orgs. It just stops people going down wrong paths.
Awesome. So we started with this thing, you know, we talked about like API first, design first, but there's all these other benefits. So do you find people come into using OpenAPI, are they always design first, or do people use OpenAPI who are not design first, who are code first, or it's a real afterthought?
Most people usually come in the other way, right? I mean, OpenAPI over the years has developed into a fairly sophisticated format that can describe a lot of different aspects. It uses JSON schema as its way of describing types and stuff. And so it takes a little bit of time to get comfortable at it. And if somebody is suddenly they're building an API, they're probably more likely familiar with the framework in their language for building APIs. And so usually people run into OpenAPI because they find some tool that generates the OpenAPI, and they start down that path. And it's only usually over time, as they build more APIs, they get more comfortable with the OpenAPI description. They're like, hey, before I build this next API, why don't I just start by actually speccing it out? Because I actually don't know which framework I'm going to use, whether I'm going to use this one or that one. And the nice thing is OpenAPI is completely agnostic to what language you end up wanting to build that API. And so somebody as a designer or a lead dev can go and spec out an API design and then hand it off to a junior and say, hey, go build an API that looks like this, using Flask or using Express.js or whatever.
Interesting. So, like the web, when I think of, you know, building a HTTP web application, I can write that in any language, right? You know, the web is kind of universal. OpenAPI is the same. You can, because you're modeling this universal open protocol, it doesn't suggest you then have to use Python or TypeScript or Node or anything. It works with anything that can create those web services or those websites.
Yep, and the beautiful thing about HTTP is it's been around for a really, really long time, and likely it will be around for quite a bit longer.
It seems so. It certainly seems so. So you've already mentioned a couple of alternatives, and I do have a conversation scheduled with your friend Kevin Swiber where we're going to get into the battle that was played out back when I worked on Azure API management just before you joined Microsoft. that was raging between some of those ones. Let's name some of them. You mentioned one already, RAML. Tell us a little bit more about those, setting us up for the conversation we'll have later this week.
So RAML was primarily a language developed by MuleSoft. Okay. And if I remember correctly, it's got some really sophisticated capabilities. These things called traits. It's got some more advanced reuse capabilities. And it has, I believe it allows you to define resources in a hierarchical structure. It's funny because OpenAPI is interesting in that it started out really simple, and that was its strength. And it was opinionated. It said, this is how we think you should do. You should build a OpenAPI. And I mean, it was really created to scratch an itch, like Tony Tam working at Reverb created it. And in order to help building the APIs that they were building, and it captured the essence of how they chose to build APIs. And I think its simplicity was one of its selling points. And that built the ecosystem. And
it was called Swagger back then? Is that right?
It was called Swagger back then, right?
Okay.
Yes. Somebody famously said, why would you waddle if you can swagger?
Is that really where the name came from?
I don't believe that's where the name came from.
That is some great revisionist history. If it is, though, it's perfect.
Yes. So it grew and delivered real value to people who were building APIs, and it was fairly simple to get started. But of course, with everything that is successful, more people want to use it for more scenarios, and more capabilities got added into it. And so there was Swagger 1.2, and then there was a Swagger 2.0. I joined after that when Swagger was the tech was acquired by SmartBear, and SmartBear donated the specification to the Linux Foundation, and that's when the OpenAPI initiative was formed. And it needed, Linux Foundation, it needed a much more official, businessy sounding name, and so OpenAPI was the name that was chosen. And so now the Swagger name it continues, but it's related to the tooling that SmartBear builds, Swagger UI, Swagger CodeGen, and so that's why you'll still hear that name a lot.
Yeah, the Open API, the open is because it's open source, right? Anyone can contribute. It's a community-led effort, and you just have to convince the 7 merge maestros that what you've suggested is a good idea for those editors to pass it. Any other players then? So we've got RAML, OpenAPI, used to be Swagger. Who else was in the mix?
There's API Blueprint, which was by a company called APIary, who were acquired by Oracle. Kind of feeling there was Mashery had one at one point, but I'm completely failing to remember the name of that.
Let's see if Kevin remembers it when we chat with him. We do the competitors.
Yeah, and it was just a case of API Blueprint was neat because you used Markdown. So you wrote in Markdown, and then you did annotations within the Markdown, and all of the different options had a bunch of different strengths and weaknesses. Really, I think the thing that won from an OpenAPI perspective was just the tooling ecosystem. That people had gone out and built stuff that delivered customers real value, and we were lucky enough with OpenAPI v3 that we made just enough changes and just enough enhancements so that the ecosystem came with us. It took a while to get support for OpenAPI 3, and I think most of what we added in OpenAPI 3 brought value. There's still some sleeper functionality in OpenAPI 3 that really hasn't taken off as it could do. But in general, most people seem to appreciate the changes that were made in 3.0.
Interesting. Well, we haven't got time on this call, but I'm very interested in what those sleeper, because I don't think I know the answer to that. Interest. So I'm gonna put a peg in that, and I'm gonna come back to you, Darrel, and maybe we'll do another one of these as a follow up. But as one of the editors of the OpenAPI spec, you obviously have this challenge now of what's going to happen next. So I guess one way I'd like to frame this to you is, what's wrong with OpenAPI? Like, I first of all, I understand you're working on a V4, that there's another version in the works, has a cool code name. It is
we have Moonwalk, but we can't let out 3.1. 3.1 is like the little version that could, and there aren't a lot of changes in there, but the big change was we fixed a really frustrating issue for a lot of people, in that in 3.0, the version of JSON schema that we were using was a really old version of JSON schema, and we didn't completely support all of the things in JSON schema, and we added some new things that weren't really compatible. And so when people tried to use JSON schema tooling with the JSON schema in OpenAPI 3.0, it didn't work. And so people had to add conversion tools, and it was just a pain. And there was a bunch of great people that really drove us in order, like Phil was one of the big people who pushed us to get free. Phil Sturgeon, yes, from
he may or may not feature this week.
So yeah, we had with some great efforts there to get us over the finish line with 3.1, and that allows us to basically decouple the JSON schema spec and the OpenAPI spec. So you just use JSON schema regular inside OpenAPI 3.1. But
which opens up all kinds of cool things, actually, like doing validation of bodies and so on, and generation of example bodies for your testing client, just using another open standard, which is extremely popular, JSON schema, right?
Yeah, and the JSON schema folks work with us really closely, and they have done all kinds of great stuff over the last number of years with all kinds of new capabilities within JSON schema. So you can do some really clever stuff in there now.
Awesome. Okay, well, I'm glad. Thanks for pushing that back in and going to 3.1. But now then, looking to V next. I guess we've got Moonwalk.
Yes, we were like, oh, this OpenAPI name. Nobody really likes this boring business suit name. We need a cool, fun name again. So,
and is this playing on the line of waddle, swagger, moonwalk being the ultimate way to move around the earth? We're all moving backwards, like
yeah.
like
or you can interpret it that way, or it could be think of it like kind of like a moonshot type of thing. However you want to interpret it.
I love it. Naming's always a fun one. Anyway, tell us a little bit more about it. Like, I guess, is there deficiencies you're looking to address in OpenAPI with Moonwalk, or is it really enhancements or a mixture?
Yeah, well, go look at our issues list of the number of features that people would like us to put into OpenAPI. There's a few recurring themes. One of them is there are certain types of APIs, HTTP APIs, that are very difficult to describe. For example, RPC type APIs, where the thing that distinguishes between one operation or another operation isn't actually in the URL, or it's not in the path. At the moment, you can't distinguish between operations using query parameters. You can't distinguish them with headers in the way that gRPC does. You can't distinguish them with values in the body like JSON RPC does. And these are all things that work over HTTP. And our goal has always been to try and support HTTP as faithfully as possible. So if you can do it over HTTP, we'd like to be able to describe it.
Okay, and is GraphQL another example? I guess they're all post operations with a different body. Is that too far a stretch?
You theoretically could. I think the end OpenAPI description wouldn't be too useful. Okay. Although maybe with Moonwalk, you might be able to define all the top level queries as different request objects. Because kind of the fundamental change that we made in Moonwalk is rather than each path item basically just getting one get, one put, one post, one delete. Now within a path item in Moonwalk, you have the notion of you have a bunch of request objects, and those request objects have a set of criteria, and it's kind of like a pattern matching, where it's like, okay, well, this request object is what gets used if you're using a get method, and if this is a value that's one of the parameters, or if this is a header, or if this is something that's in the body. We have a very flexible way of now kind of using like pattern matching in order to match, like, this is the incoming request. Okay, well, then it corresponds to this particular request. And then we associate the set of responses to the particular request that came in. And that's something else that was a little flaky to do in OpenAPI 3.1. There was kind of, well, here's your request, which could be JSON schema with a bunch of different one-ofs, and here's a bunch of responses, but there was no really easy way of correlating them. So people would often ask us, like, well, here I have a bunch of examples of a bunch of different inputs, and I want to correlate it with a bunch of outputs. And really the only way we could do that is, well, you can put a key in the examples and make sure the key in the responses match. There wasn't a really semantically rich way of doing that. So that's one of the biggest changes that we made in the Moonwalk spec.
And so that's awesome. It's good to understand, how you're just looking to sort of expand the scope of where OpenAPI can be applied, because it has some limitations today over the sort of APIs that are possible. What's the timeline look like on this? When is V4 going to drop? Where are you at? Is it brand new? We'll talk in a minute about how people can get involved in all this stuff. I think that's important to close out. But tell me, what's the timeline look like for V4?
We've never been very good at being precise about timelines. It's funny how a
sounds like software engineering
community, to me. Yeah, because it's all people who are kind of doing this on the side. Like, it's nobody's full-time job. Yeah. It's nobody's part-time job, as far as the OpenAPI initiative is concerned. So we are actively working on looking at surveying the areas of OpenAPI 3.1 that we think could really benefit from a major version bump. We're looking at doing something better in security, because whilst we have some security description capabilities, they're not very rich. We don't have a really great way of describing a good auth-z model. We do have the ability to attach scopes to individual operations, but it's fairly limited in what you can do. So we're exploring at the moment. I expect a couple more months of that, and then we need to go and I would hope by the summer that we have like a solid first draft of the V4 spec, and then we will iterate over it. Like, ideally, and I'm really making things up here, ideally we iterated over it for the next 6 months or so, and then like kind of early next year would be like my ideal timeline.
So hopefully, we got some folks to listen into the chat today, and they're excited about this, and they're particularly excited about V4 because suddenly OpenAPI, if it just did X or Y, I could use it, and so they're excited about Moonwalk. How would they get involved? And we'll add links, of course, to the comments section here. But like, what would that look like if they want to participate and give support?
So the majority of the conversation today is happening in a repository in the GitHub OAI org. The repository is called Moonwalk, and the discussions tab is where a lot of the conversations are happening. As I mentioned earlier, we do have a Slack channel, and I believe somewhere there is now a link that you can actually sign up for that Slack channel. We'll have to go dig that out.
We'll find it.
We'll find it and post
I found it because I'm in it, but so it's definitely out there. Yeah.
Yep. And in the OAI org.
That's OpenAPI initiative is what OAI stands for.
OpenAPI initiative. It's very confusing now. Everybody's talking about OpenAI because without the P, it means something completely different.
I've just been helping someone with OpenAI APIs, and we're moving to OpenAPI, which makes it even worse that the email I sent out, I just dropped a letter from OpenAPI, but it was the wrong letter. Luckily, it wasn't the P, it was the E. But okay.
So in our OpenAPI specification repo, if you look at the GitHub issues, there's a bunch that are labeled housekeeping, and we have the agenda for our weekly meeting there. And it's open for people to go and add agenda items if you want to come and discuss an item where you think you've got an amazing idea for OpenAPI in the future, or you have a challenge, you want to talk to a bunch of people who really care deeply about this project. We meet every Thursday.
I think that's one of the things that I observe about this community is, people really care about it. We launched, I don't want this to be too promotional about Zuplo, as I mentioned. We launched Zuplo. It had a proprietary routing definition, JSON-based, very similar, but we made a conscious decision not to use OpenAPI at the beginning. We added an OpenAPI import button and found that pretty much everyone who came to the product pressed it and tried to import an OpenAPI, and we just saw this nightmare workflow and realized the passion people have around this, and also the opportunities it creates for us to do things like linting with folks, and all of those. I think the hub and is OpenAPI and the spoke of all the other benefits you can get from it, which we'll talk more about the rest of this week. Got us really excited. So a huge thank you from us at Zuplo, and I think everybody else who uses OpenAPI for all the hard work you folks do. As you mentioned, it's not it's not a paid gig. This just comes from a heart of people really caring about this stuff, like yourself, Phil, Kevin, all these folks, Eric, Kin, this whole gang. So thank you. Probably a good point to wrap it up, unless there's anything else you want to throw at me in the last closing minute.
So the only thing I will throw, I mentioned before, is there's this notion of the API design language. And one of our challenges as we continue to add more features and more functionality to OpenAPI, we get some people who are like, oh, it's too complicated. It's too hard because you've added all of these features. It's great that it now supports all of this, but... And so what we are seeing is this trend of people creating API design languages that are higher level languages that then convert to OpenAPI. And we're actually doing this within Microsoft, and it's a project which was called Cattle, which is now called TypeSpec. And so the analogy is that TypeSpec is to OpenAPI what TypeScript is to JavaScript.
Okay, love it.
And the idea, it feels like a programming language. You can import things. It feels like TypeScript, but you're designing your API, and then you can just compile it to OpenAPI, and you get the entire ecosystem. And I think it meets a large audience of people who are like, yeah, that OpenAPI is useful, but I really don't want to write that by hand. And our org is telling us we have to go and design first. Take a look at TypeSpec. I've found it as it's just really nice to be able to concisely describe APIs. I had an API that I described the other day. It was 500 lines of TypeSpec, and it compiled into 5,000 lines of OpenAPI.
That's a lot. Wow. I'll back this. We took a look at it, I think, before you renamed it when it was Cattle. The team got really excited about it. I think it's very, very cool looking. We're huge TypeScript fans as well. So pretty much everything we do is in TypeScript almost. I would 100% back that. And we'll include a link to TypeSpec as well so people can check that out. But at that point, I think we'll wrap things up then, Darrel. I'll say a huge thank you for joining us and being our first guest. And I'm sure I'll try and hook you up to do some more chats, and you can tell us about the hidden gems in 3.
Yes.
That aren't
sleeper functionality.
Sleeper functionality. I genuinely have no idea what you're talking about in this case, so I'm quite excited to find out. But thanks again, and for the listeners and folks listening, check out the other videos that are coming later in the week. We'll have one per day, so some pretty exciting content if you found this interesting.
Thanks, Josh.
Thanks, Darrel. Cheers.